We will now begin session 3 of the forum. The third session will be on exploratory approaches to emerging technologies and human rights impact assessment, how to assess the human rights impact of new technologies. In the first half of the session, we will have 2 presentations from our 2 presenters. And then after a brief break to rearrange the stage, we will immediately proceed to our panel discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first presenter. Our first presenter for this session is Dr. Min-Woo Kim, who is the Managing Director of UNHRC's Asia Business and Human Rights Center. Dr. Kim.
네, 안녕하세요, 여러분. 오늘 세 번째 세션인데 이렇게 많이 또 계속해서 참석해 주셔서 너무 감사를 드립니다. 이번 세션에 제가 발제할 내용의 주제가 탐색적인 어떤 모색들, 특히 인권 영향 평가를 신기술에 적용해서 어떻게 할 것인가에 관련된 부분들인데, 사실 신기술 자체가 워낙 빠른 속도로 계속해서 진화하고 있는 상황이기 때문에 우리가 이렇게 계속해서 진화하는 신기술이 가지는 파장과 인권적 영향을 정확하게 현재 가늠한다는 것 자체가 사실 쉽지 않은 부분들이 있습니다. 그래서 제가 논의드리고자 하는 주제들이 어떤 구체적 인디케이터나 아니면 구체적인 강론을 담는다기보다는 이런 논의가 시작되는 단계에서 꼭 필요한 어떤 기본적인 원칙과 방향, 그리고 그러한 것들을 담아낼 수 있는 프레임워크를 중심으로 말씀드리는 것이 좋을 것 같습니다. 그래서 오늘 제 프레젠테이션은 영어로 좀 진행을 하고요. 한국 오디언스 분들이 많기 때문에 이후에 혹시 질문이 있으시면 한국어로 좀 편안하게 질의응답하실 수 있는 시간을 가지도록 하겠습니다. I'll begin with my presentation with this question. Why human rights impact assessment on new technologies? Disruptive technological revolution, so-called fourth the wave of the industrial revolution, has a huge impact throughout our lives. For instance, as we have seen in response to COVID-19 pandemic, we are living in the world heavily influenced by not only AI and data technologies, but also a variety of other new revolutionary technologies, including those of bio and medical sectors. Although almost all the industries are undergoing rapid changes due to technological innovation, its huge impact on human rights, human dignity and values has not been discussed substantially. However, even at this moment, when talking about the necessity of human rights impact assessment on new technologies, businesses and citizens still face the new human rights challenges in their daily operations and everyday lives. The awareness of this reality should be the starting point for us when we devise how to assess it. Before we talk about human rights impact assessment on new technologies, let's think of the current trend in business and human rights, particularly human rights due diligence, including human rights impact assessment. Actually, this map illustrates the state of play of mandatory human rights due diligence initiatives, legislation, and movement across different countries in Europe. For one example, on February 12, German government ministers put forward a draft law on corporate human rights due diligence in supply chains. On March 3rd, proposal was adopted by German cabinet, and it will soon be debated in parliament. So if you see this map, you can see the red territories of the map. So maybe you can recognize that many of the countries actually are so hardly trying to push the human rights mandatory due diligence in Europe. In addition to it, on March 8th, the European Parliament made a call to urgently adopt binding requirement in the EU to prevent and address adverse impact on human rights, the environment, and good governance, and companies' supply chains. If these efforts come to fruition, new laws will put in place clear rules for what companies and their investors will have to do respect human rights. If we summarize the EU legislations, it can be like this: hold companies accountable for harm caused people and planet. So according to it, due diligence requires companies to identify, address, and remedy their impact on human rights and environment throughout their value chain. Rules should apply to all companies operating in EU internal market, including those from outside the EU. Sanctions for non-compliance and legal support for victims of corporations in third countries, ban and import of product linked to the severe human rights violations such as forced or child labor. If we think of the complicated network of business globally, maybe this legislation is achieved in that area, probably its impact will be worldwide. Maybe you can easily guess that. So, given this current international trend in business and human rights due diligence for new technology, even the new tech companies, seems to be inevitable. Now let's think of it. How do we assess human rights impact on new technologies effectively? To find the answer to this question, I would like to suggest two ways of approaches. First, to review previous industrial revolutions and find implications for the 4IR. And secondly, to evaluate current assessment system on business and human rights from the perspective of disruptive new technologies. This chart shows the major victims and pushback of previous industrial revolutions based on research with Professor Searle and Connolly. In brief, the first industrial revolution, the major victims were factory workers, children, and women. As the pushback of this negative impact, we experienced the labor movement in Europe. During the second industrial revolution, international workers' rights was highlighted in response to the adverse impact on factory workers. In this context, we may say the adverse impact on the supply chain workers and communities during the third industrial revolution led to the establishment of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Underlying commonality of previous industrial revolutions in terms of victims and pushbacks are insufficient stakeholder engagement and dialogue for social consensus and solutions. The first industrial revolution, digital industrial revolution to change the paradigm of the industries, has a tremendous impact on the entire social system beyond labor. So, the way to minimize social cost and fairly distribute its benefit will be able to start with effective stakeholder engagement. To reflect previous experiences and lessons, the UNGPs emphasizes the stakeholder engagement-based due diligence for companies as the essential way to respect human rights. Its paragraph 17 stipulates that in order to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their adverse human rights impact, business enterprises should carry out human rights due diligence. The process should include assessing actual and potential human rights impact, integrating and acting upon the findings, tracking responses, and communicating how impacts are addressed. So, from this perspective, the human rights due diligence should cover adverse human rights impact that business enterprise may cause or contribute to through its own activities, or which may be directly linked to its operation, products, and services by its business relationships. Also will vary in complexity with size of the business enterprises, the risk of severe human rights impact, and the nature of context of its operations. In parallel with the UNGPs, OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible business conduct proposes the following 6 steps of process. First, embed responsible business conduct into policies and management system. Second, identify and assess adverse impact. Third, seize, prevent, or mitigate adverse impact. First, track implementation and result. And fifth, communicate how impact are addressed. And finally, provide for or cooperate in remediation when appropriate. So we may say that all these steps can be effectively implemented when they are based on active stakeholder engagement. Once again, okay? I will show you another chart. This demonstrates the corporate human rights benchmark assessment categories on human rights level. So please pay attention to the A, B, C, D, E, F processes. Okay, regarding time limitation, I would like to point out the category D. Unlike other categories, the category D concerned with company human rights practices varies by industry. In other words, it reflects the fact there is no one-size-fits-all approach to human rights assessment. In this regard, stakeholder engagement is once more emphasized in the current benchmark, and this principle gives us a meaningful implication for new tech businesses. Why we need to start our devising of the new system or the improvement of the current systems for new technology areas. Probably it can be directly linked to the current discussion. Guidance on human rights impact assessment of digital activities by Danish Institute for Human Rights. All 5 steps, planning and scoping, data collection and situational context analysis, analyzing impact, impact prevention, mitigation, remediation, and reporting, monitoring, and evaluation. All this process seems to be similar with conventional human rights due diligence processes, but it's very important. It's applied to the digital activities. Also, it's based on stakeholder engagement. Given the great uncertainty of quickly changing digital technologies and their unpredictable impact, it seems to be a reasonable way to deal with it. In my personal opinion, currently it's the best way to approach it to the new challenges and new environment regarding the new technologies. So, we can think of the key questions like this. Based on what we discussed until now, it seems clear that effective stakeholder engagement is the key success factor in conducting an effective human rights impact assessment, even in new tech businesses. The question is, given scope, scale, remediability, how we can define relevant stakeholders and suggest their engagement system. What's my suggestions? As you know very well, these questions cannot be answered clearly by mere single human rights actor, such as business, government, civil society, IOs, or scholars. As other presenters and discussants today in this forum emphasized many times, holistic approach based on systematic research and also well-organized discussion of the potential stakeholders are crucial to tackling these challenges, I think. However, taking into consideration the limitation of the current international mechanisms in response to disruptive technological changes, I would like to suggest following two ways. First, further develop current corporate human rights impact assessment guidelines by flexibly reflecting industry-specific corporation situations. Although this is not sufficient to provide perfect solutions at the very least, it may complement current guidelines by highlighting salient issues of new technologies in each industries. Whenever I did, I conducted human rights due diligence, including the human rights impact assessment for companies. I could find that most of the answer to the problems could be found from the honest conversation with stakeholders. Secondly, I would like to suggest that quickly establish an international sort of organization, entity, for research and discussion to cope with the technological revolution and consequent global impact on the entire social system. Given the huge social cost of past industrial revolution and uncertain impact of new technologies, which is essential for us to minimize adverse impact of industrial paradigm shifting by integrating actual and potential stakeholders into open discussions. Even it's not easy for us to actually mapping who can be the proper stakeholders to be engaged in our conversation regarding the specific industrial areas. So we need a kind of research to define who are stakeholders, what can be the salient issues in that area, how we can include them. So also we need to provide a kind of environment and space to talk about it without any worries about their interest. Okay? So I hope the timely response of international society to newly emerging human rights issues will be able to protect marginalized people and effectively enhance eventual benefit of a new technology for humankind. Based on my research, finally, I believe that we can achieve kind of enhanced productivity thanks to the new technologies. But in the process to achieve that goals, history shows us that there is a huge burden on the most vulnerable group of the society. I think we need to prevent it and we don't repeat it that kind of a sad story through our lessons from the history. So the first step for effective human rights impact assessment will be start with effective stakeholder engagement. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. I would now like to introduce our second presenter for this session, Professor Lorna McGregor from the University of Essex, who will be joining us online.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be able to participate in this conference and very much thank the organisers, Professor So, for the invitation. I'm just sorry that I can't be in Seoul as we were a couple of years ago for this incredibly important forum. However, as I said, I'm delighted that I'm able to participate online along with many distinguished presenters and participants. In the time that I have today, I would like to focus on 3 points. First, as the theme of the panel is on addressing the impact of technology on human rights, I would like to look at human rights impact assessments because they are receiving significant attention at the moment within the tech sector. And they're really being portrayed as the central mechanism to be able to identify and mitigate human rights harm. So first, I want to look at the critical importance of human rights impact assessments. Second, I then want to look at some of the challenges with carrying out human rights impact assessments in the tech sector. And third, I would like to close, and I think this very much complements the presentation we've just heard. I would like to close by encouraging us not to lose sight of the specific role played by human rights impact assessments, and to encourage us against seeing them or treating them as synonymous with the obligations of states and responsibilities of businesses to address human rights harm, because they're only one part of the picture of what we're expecting states and businesses to do. So turning to human rights impact assessments and looking at why are they receiving so much attention within the tech sector. Well, the first point I think is important to highlight is that human rights impact assessments, particularly in the tech sector, seem to be commonly associated with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And they're very much spoken about in relation to businesses' responsibilities on human rights, although the principles themselves do not actually refer to human rights impact assessments specifically. But human rights impact assessments have emerged as one way in which to operationalize Principle 18 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which requires business enterprises to identify and assess any actual or potential adverse human rights impacts with which they may be involved, either through their own activities or a result of their business relationships. Now, when we see that responsibility of businesses to identify and assess any actual or potential adverse human rights impacts, and the emergence of human rights impact assessments as a mechanism for meeting that responsibility, we can also see that under international human rights law, states have the same obligations, both in relation to their direct actions or inactions, and in their positive obligations to protect individuals from human rights harm from third parties. So while in the tech sector, we are most often referring to human rights impact assessments in relation to businesses, I think it's really critical for us to remember that human rights impact assessments are a mechanism for both states and businesses to identify and address human rights harm. And so it's really important that we think about all actors, and human rights impact assessments is relevant to all actors in the AI or technology ecosystem. Now, I think the slides that I sent are maybe not up, but what I would like to encourage you to do is to look at the excellent materials produced by the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And they have a lot of materials on what human rights impact assessments are and what they look like. And they have a great diagram, which they have online, which they go through the different phases of human rights impact assessments. So they advance 5 phases, the first being planning and scoping, the second on data collection and baseline development, the third on analysing impacts, the fourth on impact mitigation and management, and the fifth on reporting and evaluation. Now, what is really important about how they explain human rights impact assessments is that they show that they're not just a one-off activity, and that there's a very systematic approach to identifying harm in the earlier phases, to then addressing it, and then to monitoring the actions that have been taken. And I think that's really critical that we understand that there is this 5-phase process to human rights impact assessments. It's not just a case of identifying harm, but it's about taking a very systematic and holistic, as the previous presenter explained, holistic approach to identifying it, addressing it, and then monitoring the actions that have been taken to see whether they're actually going to be effective. And when we understand human rights impact assessments in this way, we can see at their best, they're going to be preventative activities. They're going to be preventative activities which identify potential harm before it occurs, and then either stop the activity so that it does not lead to harm. And, for example, in the tech sphere, it may be that through an early human rights impact assessment at the conceptualization or design phase of an algorithm, it's possible to see that it may have a discriminatory effect, even if not intended. And what that allows for is either to stop the development of that algorithm altogether or to redesign it so that it doesn't have that effect once it's actually deployed. So human rights impact assessments are really critical at the early stage to prevent human rights harm from ever occurring. But they're also really important, as we've discussed, for stopping harm where it's identified through the obligation of cessation, and to guarantee its non-recurrence. So again, human rights impact assessments are not one-off activities, but they feed into the full work of businesses and states to make sure that any harm is not repeated in other areas of the business or state activity. And as the previous presenter really emphasized, the 5-phase approach is itself critical, but what is also really important is the engagement of stakeholders, both in predicting the impact of particular activities of a business or state, and for assessing and monitoring the effect of activities that are already being carried out. So from all that, we can see that human rights impact assessments are incredibly important in the tech sphere for preventing harm and for addressing it where it actually occurs. But to turn to my second point, there are significant challenges in implementation of human rights impact assessments in the tech sector. Now, the first central challenge is that at the moment, human rights impact assessments are expected as part of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But as we know, the UNGPs are not mandatory. And we also have very little knowledge about how companies in general in the tech sector are meeting their responsibilities to identify and mitigate human rights harm, including through carrying out human rights impact assessments. So this is leading to debates on whether human rights impact assessments should be mandatory, including through wider initiatives for mandatory due diligence obligations of companies, and also in the tech sector through draft legislation on AI regulation, and as we're seeing in a number of national contexts, draft legislation on algorithmic risk assessments. So there's a big question around the effectiveness of human rights impact assessments where they're not mandatory for businesses. And as I've said, in relation to states, they are a tool to fulfill states' obligations on human rights, but again, not mandatory as a particular process to conduct. So there is a question around whether they should be mandatory, and also how we learn about what companies and businesses actually are doing in relation to impact assessments, because they're not always reported and they're not always published, although there is some good practice by businesses in publishing impact assessments which they've commissioned. The second challenge with human rights impact assessments, and I'm sure this has been discussed throughout the day, is how do we understand the impact of technology on human rights? Because how we understand the impact of technology on human rights will affect the reach and the scope of human rights impact assessments, and in turn affect their effectiveness in actually identifying and mitigating human rights harm. Now, in the tech sector, we know that commonly affected rights are the rights to privacy, to non-discrimination, and the freedom rights, like freedom of expression, freedom of thought. But while those rights and the threats to those rights run through a number of different technologies, what we also know is that the context in which new and emerging technologies are designed, developed, and deployed has significant implications for the impact on human rights. So the context, what sector is this being employed in? For example, what are the impacts on the right to education, where technologies are deployed in schools or universities? Why is technology being introduced? The reasons for use are very important to understand what are technologies replacing. And what is the impact of introducing these technologies, and how does that affect human rights? Who are the actors deploying the technology, and who are the individuals and communities subject to the technologies, as we also understand that technology impacts individuals and communities in different ways. And groups in traditionally marginalised positions can often be even more adversely affected by the use of technology. So it's absolutely critical that we understand the impact of introducing technology in particular contexts in order to understand the full human rights impact. Now, at the same time, what we can see in national AI strategies that have been developed around the world, as well as corporate AI policies, is that the full human rights impact of new and emerging technologies is often not referred to. So we will often just see specific rights being referred to in these strategies and policies, like privacy or like discrimination. And we rarely see references to the context in which these technologies are introduced. And if we don't see that full human rights impact assessment being acknowledged at the policy level, we're unlikely to see human rights impact assessments also picking up on that full impact on human rights. And that can mean that human rights impact assessments are less effective than we expect them to be in identifying and mitigating human rights harm. So that's really important for us to think about. How can they be effective if they're not looking at the full scope of human rights impacts? A third question in relation to carrying these out is who is actually carrying out these impact assessments? Because along with the need to be able to understand the full impact on human rights, it's also unlikely that that full impact will be uncovered if we don't have expert interdisciplinary teams. And that has been a critique that has been emerging in relation to impact assessments, where we don't see very experienced and interdisciplinary teams that are able to look at the impact of technologies from all these different angles that I've been talking about. Actually, there requires a very high level of expertise and a range of disciplines and a range of expertise in teams to be able to effectively carry out human rights impact assessments in the tech sector. Another criticism about impact assessments is whether it's possible to carry them out effectively and uncover the full human rights impact of new and emerging technologies if there's a lack of transparency. Now, we've heard so much about the lack of transparency in relation to new and emerging technologies, and this can start at the level of the fact that they're actually being used at all, but also understanding why they have been introduced, how they've been developed, how they operate, how they work. There's a whole range of ways in which we don't understand the full way in which technology is being used by businesses and by states. And if we don't understand that, it's very difficult for those carrying out impact assessments to actually be able to really identify the risks to human rights. And we see a number of impact assessments where there's a lot of caveats at the beginning to explain the limitations of the impact assessment. So for those carrying out the impact assessments, a lack of transparency can mean that they are not as effective in identifying human rights harm, but also a lack of transparency can limit stakeholder engagement because the stakeholders don't have the full information about why technologies are being introduced, the different types of models considered, how they are working in practice. It's very difficult for stakeholders to effectively engage and comment on the impact they're having on human rights. And as Sabrina will talk about on the panel, the other interesting challenge for actually implementing human rights impact assessments within the tech sector is the question around how they actually interact and intersect with other impact assessments that states and businesses are required to carry out. So while human rights impact assessments under the UNGPs are not mandatory, in different parts of the world, there are other impact assessments that are mandatory that businesses and states have to carry out. And this may be under privacy legislation, data protection impact assessments under the GDPR, for example, environmental impact assessments, and other impact assessments that we're seeing, for example, under the draft legislation on algorithmic accountability, where states and businesses may be required to carry out impact assessments which may pick up on certain human rights issues. So there's a question and a challenge for states and businesses about how to effectively organise and carry out impact assessments where they pick up on human rights issues, and whether they can actually develop these impact assessments further to introduce some of the methodology that human rights impact assessments have, such as stakeholder engagement, which we don't often see in other types of impact assessments. So the second point that I'm making is yes, human rights impact assessments are incredibly important and can play a really important role in preventing human rights harm from materializing, identifying it where it is occurring and stopping it immediately, and learning from what is found in a human rights impact assessment and guaranteeing that it doesn't happen again. But there are significant challenges within the tech sector in carrying out these effectively, and we really need to be able to address these to ensure that human rights impact assessments play an important role in identifying and addressing human rights harm. The third point that I would like to make to close is that while human rights impact assessments are critically important, there is a significant risk in the tech sector that they are receiving too much focus to the exclusion of the other types of activities, laws, policies, and practices that states and businesses have to also carry out. And so there's a risk that at the moment when human rights impact assessments are spoken about, they are treated as the only activity that states and businesses are required to carry out in order to identify and address harm. And so there's a risk that they become synonymous with states' obligations and businesses' responsibilities. And while human rights impact assessments are critical, and if we saw them being carried out in the full way envisaged by organisations like the Danish Institute for Human Rights would receive significantly greater protection. Their effectiveness depends on their location within a multi-layered and systemic approach to states' obligations and businesses' responsibilities to respect and protect human rights. And so we can't just look at human rights impact assessments alone, but what we do need to see within companies and within states is, first of all, leadership and commitment to human rights. So that's in relation to products, services, but also the business model and the full way in which a business and a state operates. And we really can't underestimate the importance of leadership in ensuring that human rights are protected. That goes together with human rights policies and practices within states and within businesses that really systematize effective processes for identifying and addressing human rights impact. Now, yes, that includes human rights impact assessments, but it also includes embedding human rights knowledge and culture within a company and a state agency, so that when any individual working in that body sees that there may be a human rights issue, they are able to report it, and there are reporting mechanisms in place together with internal oversight and monitoring processes, and also grievance mechanisms that receive individual complaints, but also look at complaints in a whole to see whether there's any patterns of complaints. And these grievance mechanisms are really important alongside other types of reporting mechanisms where an individual or an organization, stakeholders, even if they are not alleging that they are a direct victim of human rights harm by a state or by a company, is able to report it. And so all these internal processes are really important alongside human rights impact assessments. And they also need to be put alongside effective AI governance or technology governance. So effective laws, policies, external and independent oversight mechanisms and remedies. Alongside funding and enabling of civil society organizations to play an important role in this respect. So while, and really just to close, while impact assessments are receiving a lot of attention, and this is important and critical, and we have to see much more attention to ensure that they're able to be effective tools in identifying and addressing human rights harm. We can't just focus on human rights impact assessments, and we need to see a full system in place within companies and within state agencies to identify and address harm, and an external AI governance framework that ensures that laws, policies, and practices are in place together with oversight and remedies so that human rights can fully be protected. I will stop here, but again, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in the panel, and I hope that we are able again to share important insights through this excellent forum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorna, for your insightful presentation. So we'll now take a 2-minute break to prepare for our panel discussion. I would like to invite our panelists to come up on the stage to prepare for the next session. Thank you.
예, 안녕하십니까. 마지막 세션 토론을 시작하겠습니다. 하루 종일 참석하시느라고 상당한 피로가 누적되었을 것으로 생각합니다. 마지막 세션에서 뭐 전체를 정리하는 또 그런 것도 있고 이야기가 조금 구체적인 쪽으로 흘러가는 것 같습니다. 그러니까 지금까지 오전 오후 세션에서 신기술과 인권이라고 하는 이제 큰 주제를 가지고 큰 그림을 그리는 이야기들이 주로 되었던 것 같습니다. 3세션은 신기술에 관한 인권 영향 평가라고 하는 이 주제를 가지고 이야기를 하겠습니다. 그래서 인권 영향 평가가 통상은 기업의 인권 영향 평가 이렇게 이제 이야기를 하는데 아까 발표하신 그 로마 교수님께서는 국가 쪽으로 또 이야기를 조금 하셨습니다. 그래서 어쨌든 이제 이 신기술과 인권이라고 하는 것을 실제로 이제 구현하는 아주 구체적인 일들을 이야기하게 되면은 인권 영향 평가라고 하는 것을 빼고는 이야기할 수가 없을 것 같습니다. 저는 서강대학교에 있고 이상수 교수입니다. 지금까지 기업과 인권이라고 하는 주제를 가지고 주로 관심을 가져왔습니다. 그런데 오늘 이제 신기술이라고 하는 또 다른 변수를 기업과 인권이라고 하는 부분에 이제 연결을 시키는 이 주제가 아마 3세션에서 중요한 주제가 아닌가 싶습니다. 그래서 오늘 이제 좀 얘기해야 될 큰 질문은 한국 사회에서 인권 영향 평가라고 하는 말이 실제로 이제 도입이 되어 있고 실제로 하고 있고 또 많은 기업들이 하고 있는데 그것이 과연 이제 현장에서 의미 있게 변화를 낳고 있는지에 대해서 의문이 여전히 있는 것 같습니다. 그런 점에서 우리가 인권 영향 평가라고 하는 것 자체의 중요성 내지 인권 영향 평가의 핵심 요소가 뭔지를 다시 한번 이렇게 확인하는, 그렇게 해서 한국에서 인권 영향 평가 내지는 인권 실사가 의무화된다고 했을 때 어떤 내용이 실제로 들어오는 것을 의미하는지 서로 이해하는 계기가 좀 되었으면 좋겠고, 또 하나는 그런 인권 경영 내지는 인권 영향 평가 또는 인권 실사에서 신기술이라고 하는 변수가 들어왔을 때 어떤 새로운 차이를 낳게 되는지, 그 부분도 토론이 되었으면 좋겠습니다. 이 두 지점도 아까 로마 선생님께서 정확하게 지적을 해주셨습니다만은 그 부분에 대해서 우리가 마지막 세션을 마치고 돌아갈 때 지식으로 삼았으면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 마지막 세션은 5시 반에 마치게 되어 있고 지금 벌써 시간이 많이 지나갔습니다. 그래서 토론하시는 분께서는 한 5분 정도씩 이렇게 짧게 토론을 해 주시면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 4분의 토론자 모셨습니다. 첫째 분은 고려대학교 법학전문대학원에 계시는 박경신 교수님이시고, 두 번째는 테레스 몰피 벨패스트 퀸즈 대학교 교수님 모셨습니다. 그리고 사브리나 라우 레섹스 대학교 경제사회연구위원회 빅데이터와 기술 프로젝트 연구원님 모셨고, 마지막으로 에밀 커넬 덴마크 국가인권위원회 기업가인권 자문관으로 계시는 분 모셨습니다. 오늘 4분께서 한 5분 정도씩 해서 한국 사회에, 그리고 이러한 인권 영향 평가의 내용, 그리고 이제 신기술과 인권 영향 평가라는 점에서 좋은 의견을 주시고 토론을 해주시기를 부탁드립니다. 먼저 박경신 교수님께 마이크를 넘기겠습니다.
Thank you for this opportunity. The title of our session is Exploratory Approaches to Human Rights Impact Assessment of Emerging Technologies. Firstly, I don't think we should reinvent the wheel. There is what we call technological impact assessment that has been done by governments around the world, starting with the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment. Also, Korea has Korea Institute of Science and Technology Evaluation and Planning. 과학기술 평가, 영향 평가원, I think. And there are laws, both in the US, in Korea, and many other countries that have created similar processes and government bodies continually evaluating technological assessment and technological impact assessment. I also participated in some of them within Korea, and it is much broader than human rights impact assessment. It does economic impact assessment, it does a political impact assessment, social impact assessment, also ethical, legal impact. And human rights impact assessment becomes one of the several facets of assessing the particular technology. Just to give you an example of just to give you a flavor of what we do, I can give you one famous example given by the first, one of the early scholars who proposed the technological assessment, Joe Coates, he talked about how television as a new technology will provide very disruptive source of entertainment in the home, and people will mingle less in local settings. There will be less interaction between neighbors, so people will be more isolated, and there will be more dependence on spouses because there is because you don't talk to neighbors for psychological needs, and as a result, a divorce rate will escalate. So you can see there are like first order, second order, third, nth order of causation that we go into. And I personally participated in the technological impact assessment on smart network, on AR, VR, augmented reality and virtual reality technology, and also hydrogen fuel cell technology as well. So I think that to the extent that we are trying to formalize under the government leadership between state parties to the UN processes, I think we should talk about how all this will fit together. So that's one comment that I wanted to make. Second comment I wanted to make is, when we say technology, there are many other technologies, but we are mainly, as the commentators in today's event did, are focusing on ICT technology, information and communication technology. So there has to be some way of justifying why there is a focus on information communication technology as opposed to non-ICT technologies, like washing machine, washer and dryer, for instance. That's a new technology. Why are we not talking about environmental impact or other impact of those technologies? And in doing so, I think there has to be some discussion of the uniqueness of ICT and its liberalizing impact and its equalizing impact. The internet back in 2011 was considered one of the facilitators of democratization movement around the world, including Jasmine Revolution. So when we do the, when we approach the ICT, when we approach ICT as opposed to non-ICT, there has to be some contextualization on the civilizational and political impact that the technology has had. And in doing so, it is important that in doing so, I think human rights impact assessment has potential for making impact assessment broader, not just on data protection and privacy, but include freedom of speech and more inclusive civic discourse among the people. Final comment I have is there are existing forums within the UN where human rights impact are discussed. That is IGF, International Internet Governance Forum. It is UN IGF, which has happened every year for more than 10 years now. I think that there has to be some discussion about how IGF will also fit into the newly proposed process today. I'll stop there. I think I filled my 5-minute time slot.
예, 감사합니다. 짧은 시간에 이제 일을 진행하다 보니까 그렇습니다. 아무튼 그 박경진 교수님께서 ICT의 인권 영향 평가의 특수성 그 부분을 강조를 해주신 것 같습니다. 이어서 발페스트 퀸즈 대학교 테레스 몰피 교수님의 코멘트를 듣겠습니다.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this Human Rights Forum and for inviting me to take part. Listening to the two speakers, Dr. Kim and Professor McGregor, I heard them urge us to be aware of everyday realities and of understandings, different understandings of human rights, narrow understandings and broad understandings. Their presentations helped me to focus on what I'm going to call mindset and method. So let me explain what I mean by mindset and method and why they're important. And to explain this, I'm going to paint a picture. And the picture has a foreground and a background. So what's in the foreground of my picture? We are the 13th Asia Human Rights Forum. And at this forum, we very clearly have a mindset and a method. We have invoked human rights law in particular, and more specifically, human rights impact assessment. We have defined ourselves through the idiom of human rights law. So we can say that we believe in, we're committed to the capacity of human rights law in this field. But remember that the picture I'm painting for you has a background, not just a foreground. So who or what is in the background? Well, for me, it's the huge range of other individuals and fora or groups, both formal and informal, who are addressing similar questions to the Asia Human Rights Forum. And these individuals at these other fora, in these other groups, will they also have, like us, a mindset and a method? Now, in some of these fora or groups, the mindset may be, let's just let the market decide. In others, it might be a type of fatalism, that the dystopian future of AI is inevitable. It's natural, and there's nothing we can do about it. Or if there was, we're too late. But there's many other fora that see the present day and the future in the way that the Asia Human Rights Forum does during this meeting. And what we and they share is a mindset that's focused on urgency, on moral urgency, on the need to demand a different relation to AI, both current AI and future or potential AI. And related to this is what we see with the focus on human rights impact assessment in this forum. There's a focus on what I'm going to call moral labor. So not just a sense of moral urgency, but a sense of taking the steps, deploying the methods, creating the culture that will create good AI or AI for good. So on the positive side, there are others that share our mindset, a belief in moral urgency and in the need for moral labor. But there are also differences between us with our commitment to human rights law and our potential allies. And I think it's important that we take account of these different mindsets and methods, because we can hypothesize a range of interactions. So for example, think about a group promoting AI ethics or responsible research and innovation or trustworthy technologies. So their starting point is not human rights law. How will they interact with a group like this forum? Will it be competition, collaboration, a sense of encroachment? How will outsiders, tech companies, or states interact with both of us? Will there be attempts to channel or to funnel particular questions towards one mindset or method, and with what effects? And I think we also need to be clear that amidst a shared commitment, at least in some places, to moral urgency, to moral labor in this field, there are very different understandings of human rights, including how human rights relates to ethics. Are human rights and ethics synonymous? And how human rights and ethics relate to law. And these different understandings create different senses of expectation and different senses of obligation. They affect when, where, and how it seems right to talk about human rights, about law, and what law is and what its capacities are, and who is getting to do the talking and what gets heard. So my recommendation is that we need to do more talking about mindset and method, and in particular, the ways in which human rights, and specifically human rights law pathways, can help to move arguments for a better AI future, for good science in the future, and help to move those arguments to different places around the world. Thank you.
사실은 이제 저도 지금 이제 신기술의 영향 평가를 해보려고 하는 이제 목전에 있는 상황에서 오늘 사회를 맡게 됐습니다. 사실은. 그래서 우리가 신기술 영향 평가를 할 때 진짜로 고민해야 되는 것이 뭐냐? 이것을 이제 오늘 시사점을 얻는다는 개인적인 목표를 가지고 왔습니다. 그래서 지금 테레사 선생님 말씀하신 부분도 우리가 마인드셋, 어떤 자세를 가질 것인가 했는데 지금 선생님께서 우리가 어떤 공감대 내지 어떤 자세, 어떤 가치 이 부분을 이제 지적을 해주셨습니다. 이 부분도 중요하게 또 토론이 될 것으로 생각을 합니다. 이어서 사비나 라우 선생님의 토론을 듣겠습니다.
Thank you very much for having me. I prepared a short presentation. Are you able to see my screen? Yes, great. So what we have is, I'd like to talk a little bit about the context. Thank you again for having me, and also for all the interesting presentations and discussions. It was really interesting points. I'd like to talk a little bit more about human rights impact assessments in a wider context. Human rights impact assessments are obviously part of a human rights due diligence toolbox, as the UNGP state, but also as the Danish institutes provided a really great guidance, for example, as Emil will probably talk about in his next presentation. But human rights impacts are not only measured by human rights impact assessments, they can be also covered in other types of assessments, as can be covered in the commentary of the UN guiding principles. And there are very impact assessments specifically to the tech sector that have significant implications on human rights, but which vary significantly in design and the implementation. So some of these impact assessments include privacy impact assessments, data protection impact assessments, ethical impact assessments, algorithmic impact assessments, and surveillance impact assessments. All of these have varying degrees. Obviously, we have the human rights impact assessments from the UN guiding principles, but we also have privacy impact assessments, which, for example, are required by law in a lot of common law countries like the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, that are hard law, and that are required of different data controls, which can be different entities. The data protection impact assessments based on GDPR in the EU context have also become hard law and requirements as different jurisdictions in the EU have taken them up and are applicable for different data controllers, not only in the EU, but also others outside. What's significant here is that they also cover technically all fundamental human rights, but in practice often tend to lean towards privacy or discrimination, unlike human rights impact assessments. And like other speakers mentioned as well, we have this ethical side and ethical impact assessments that have come about and that are gaining tractions. And you have these impact assessments and guidelines that come out by civil society, academia, but also by businesses themselves in trying to organize and create guidance of how best to develop these technology and deploy them and how to assess these impacts. Similarly, you have them for specific technologies or even more specific purposes, such as data reuse assessments that some academics are talking about, or even surveillance impact assessments, which are a lot more specific. Additionally, with new EU regulation on AI coming out, impact assessment specific on algorithmic accountability and algorithmic and automation is becoming more prevalent. So for data controls and companies operating in this digital space, you have a lot of different impact assessments and different requirements that are asked of these companies that seem to be diverging into different directions, some more compliance related and some more on a voluntary basis. However, as some of these, so the question is how we can potentially bring those together, or how these impact assessments can learn from each other, and whether that's a useful activity in itself. So taking, for example, the human rights impact assessments under the UNGPs and the data protection impact assessments under GDPR, we see here on the slide two different processes, both cyclical processes with very similar components of what the process actually entails, both including some kind of planning and scoping, some initial assessment, some measures and reporting elements, and some engagement. However, on a closer look, these actually vary quite a bit. So for example, while all human rights sources and instruments and principles are included in a human rights impact assessment, a data protection impact assessment focuses on all fundamental rights, but in implications, as I mentioned earlier, focuses only on, or usually focuses on privacy. But however, includes some substantive rights that are not included in instruments, in international human rights instruments, such as the right of erasure, the right of data portability, which are not found in international human rights law. So there are ways in which these processes can inform each other as well. Additionally, big limitations of a data protection impact assessment, for example, has been noted that they're only requiring impact assessments for activities resulting in high risk, not all activities, like in a human rights impact assessment that requires and takes note of potential sequencing and prioritization of different impacts. But rather DPIAs only focus on the high impact. Additionally, while there's consultation with supervisory authorities in data protection impact assessments, there's no consultation required of individual rights holders, which is obviously in human rights impact assessments a very important element to empower users. So while the processes look quite similar, there's a lot of differences when you look more at the specifics. And these are, of course, only two of the many impact assessments that I mentioned on the previous slides. So what this brings about is questions about what kind of challenges and opportunities exist in bringing together these various impact assessment methodologies and how they could potentially inform each other. for businesses if they have to do the same type of assessment at different levels and different bodies within the company, for example. It might improve efficiency to bring processes together. But what might that take on, what might that take for the business? At the same time, if we have oversight bodies, such as for data protection bodies, oversight bodies, what kind of expertise would be required to really take into account the full scale of impact, human rights impact that would be required to be assessed in this? So looking really at what would it take not only at a theoretical level in terms of bringing these together, but also operationally, what are the practicalities in keeping them separate, but also bringing them together? And what are the risks involved in that? Are there, the danger, of course, is missing out certain human rights elements. But the important thing is really ensuring that human rights law and principles really remain central to any impact assessment process. So in this way, while there are so many assessments coming up and there's high demands on data controllers, which can be not only businesses, but also other actors, the question is really how can we create efficient processes that accurately and effectively understand impact, but in order to be able to address and remedy potential impact to prevent it in the future as well. So for this, moving forward, we really need to make sure that the priority needs to remain on identifying, addressing effectively the impact of various technologies on all human rights and how processes can come together. And regardless of the name of the type of impact assessment, it's not, as Professor Lorna McGregor was saying earlier, it's not only about the impact assessment, it's about the wider systems as well. And human rights due diligence, and especially emerging trends of mandatory human rights due diligence, will be a great part in that. And if that is strengthened, perhaps these different assessments could come under this as well. Ultimately, the main focus has to be that a human rights-based approach with principles of transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, and empowerment must be central to any assessment methodology, whether they're kept separate or brought together. So this should really push us forward to thinking not only about the types of compliance activities that companies are required to do now and the types of assessments that are currently already required to take place or that are taking place voluntarily, but also how it shapes new regulations and laws that are coming in the form of data protection or AI regulation, and how human rights can be built into that as well. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 인권 영향평가 이외에도 다양한 종류의 영향평가가 있기 때문에 그와 비교하면서 인권 영향평가에서 특별히 이제 관심을 가져야 될 부분들을 이제 강조를 해주신 것으로 생각이 됩니다. 오늘 아침에도 이야기했는데 오늘 홀리스틱 어프로치라는 단어가 여러 번 사용이 되고 이 신기술이라고 하는 것이 삶 전체에 영향을 미치기 때문에 전체적인 접근이 필요하고 또 인권 전체를 다뤄야 되기 때문에 인권적인 접근이 필요하고 그걸 전부 다루는 정책이라고 하는 것도 단편적이고 편린적인 것으로 해결되지 않고 전체적인 접근이 필요하다. 이 홀리스틱 어프로치가 말은 좋은데 어떻게 이해를 해야 될지 그걸 상당히 어려운 과제를 제기하는 것 같습니다. 그렇기 때문에 어떤 점에서 우리가 영향평가한다고 하는 것은 우선순위를 고려하지 않을 수가 없고 절차와 투명성이라고 하는 어떤 보완이라고 할까 그런 부분이 병행될 수밖에 없는 것 같습니다. 우리 다음에 발표하실 분은 굉장히 중요하신 분인데 덴마크 국가인권위원회 기업가인권 자문관으로 계신 에밀 커널이랍니다. 이분이 특별히 중요한 이유는 이제 덴마크 국가인권위원회에서 디지털 인더스트리 그러니까 신기술과 관련되는 인권 영향 평가에 관한 굉장히 방대한 그 매뉴얼을 만들어서 이제 글로벌에 유포를 했고 거기에 대해서 아까 로마 선생님께서도 훌륭한 것으로 칭찬을 이렇게 하였습니다. 저도 그거를 이제 읽어봤고 이렇게까지 방대한 작업이 있었다라고 하는 것에 상당히 놀라움을 금치 못하였습니다. 이런 부분을 포함해서 우리 커넬 선생님께서 토론을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Thank you very much for giving me the word, and thank you for inviting me to present today. I'm very happy about that, and thank you to all the previous speakers as well. I will try to keep it short in the interest of time, but I just wanted to share a few slides, and I'll also try to reflect on what other speakers have been saying. I hope that's working. So this I'm not going to linger on, but this all relates to the work that we have done on human rights impact assessment. And I just want to put out a few reminders from how we see what this really is from our perspective. First of all, human rights due diligence is the requirement, as has been told by many of the former speakers. I also listened into the previous session a bit, and it was very clear there as well that human rights impact assessment is not the requirement. As we see it, human rights impact assessment is a tool in the toolbox among many others. So that also means that, you know, some of the other impact assessments that have been mentioned before by Sabrina or by Professor Park obviously also are part of this broader due diligence toolbox that exists. And when we talk about human rights impact assessment, we talk about it as a methodology that's used in relation to a particular project, product or service in a particular context, because otherwise, as you will see in my next slide, some of the aspects of the methodology simply become sort of impossible if it's a global assessment. And that also goes to some of the points by Professor Murphy, that, you know, how are you actually going to take into consideration these other points of views? How are you going to really consider the background, if you will? And if you have a global perspective, that becomes a completely impossible task, in my view. But as we see it, it still is a key tool, can be a key tool in context of severe potential and their actual impacts. Again, not going to linger because of the interest of time, but as you've seen before, we have this methodology with the different steps. And I think what's particularly important here is that we place stakeholder engagement in the center. So again, goes back to what Professor Murphy as well was saying about, you know, how do you bring in these other voices? Because you need to understand how this plays out in a particular context. You need to understand what are the interests of people, you know. Of course, you know, you could say that someone has been impacted by a technology, even though that person doesn't perceive it as such, but you need to still consider that perception. But what we have tried to develop is this guidance that is both for developers of these technologies, but also for users or buyers, because what we're seeing is that it's not a tech sector problem anymore. It's a problem in all sectors, because there's not one, you know, modern company that is not going through a digital transformation or transition, that does not try to use AI or try to use other digital solutions within their existing business model. You know, you can question, is a shipping company today, is it a tech company that has ships, or is it you know, a shipping company as they used to be? I think that's an important thing to consider. We're also really focusing this guidance on digital activities, and I think that's the terminology that we've used, and you can call it the working definition, because I think what was discussed previously today about this datafication cycle is really what we're trying to look at. Because as Professor Devya said earlier, there is not a lack of guidance traditionally in this space, and I think that's true for almost all sectors. I think when it comes to this kind of impacts, I think there's not a lack of knowledge, but maybe it's still a lack of bringing that knowledge from academia, from civil society to the businesses. So maybe there has still been a lack of guidance. What's really central in our methodology is the stakeholder engagement. And that means that local context becomes essential, because yes, you can do some very broad global stakeholder engagement into, you know, some new technology, but you're really not going to understand its impacts until you get closer to a local context, until you can really see how it is applied, who is using it, who is subjected to it, what are their thoughts, what is the regulation in that context. So of course you can start the analysis, but to really get close to identifying impacts, you need to come closer. So I just wanted to bring up these 5 themes, and then I'll stop. That there is this problem with this kind of global ideas of many of these technologies that we're talking about. You know, they can be used anywhere. With the internet, they can be spread anywhere. They can be used by anyone at any time, which seems to have meant that many of the impact assessments that have actually taken place have been on a very global level. But how are you really going to then, you know, back to the stakeholder engagement question, back to, you know, what is the background, if you will, using Professor Murphy's discussion from earlier? Well, you know, you can't use a global background, I think. You need to actually get closer to see what it really means for the lives of people. I think you also need to, you know, some issues are getting outsized attention, I think. Because, you know, this comes from the privacy angle, it comes from freedom of expression, a lot of the discussions on technologies. But, you know, if you talk about the right to privacy being violated, you shouldn't stop there. You should have this holistic approach that we've been talking about today, because how your right to privacy is violated, what that might then mean for other rights will also be different in different contexts. You need to go kind of through the full process of saying, you know, will that have an impact on the right to education, as Lorna talked about before? And that goes to the third point, that there is a real need to not stop at a first kind of order impact. And also, as Professor Park was talking about in relation to technology impact assessment, you need to think about second order, third order, to really see where is it that it really hurts? What is it that's really problematic? Because even if a person, I think it was mentioned in the previous session in South Korea, have not been that concerned about the privacy impacts with some of the COVID-19 measures, but maybe the impacts that could then arise because of the privacy impacts people might be concerned about. Early assessments are essential, but then a final point that I think is essential is also to consider cumulative impacts. You're not alone in this ecosystem. Whatever technology you have, you depend on a lot of other technologies, and people use a lot of different technologies, and how they interplay might also have a huge role in how you perceive the impacts, what impacts rights holders are really feeling, and that should be part of an impact assessment as well. Thank you. I'll stop there.
예, 고맙습니다. 얘기들이 이제 조금 중복되는 것들도 상당히 있는 것 같습니다. 아까 홀리스틱 이야기했는데 이분도 이제 개발자와 사용자, 구매자를 전부 포괄하는 연권 영향평가, 에코시스템 전체를 고려하는 영향평가를 말씀하셨고, 심각성을 이야기하시면서 우선순위에 대해서도 이제 우리가 충분히 이해를 할 수가 있고, 추가해서 이제 누적적 영향이라든지 초기 평가의 중요성, 특히 기술 분야에서 이런 부분을 지적했죠. 특히 이제 이해관계자의 중요성에 대해서 몇 번 강조를 해주셨습니다. 그리고 지금 발표하시는 분이 특별히 이제 강조를 안 하셨는데 제가 꼭 좀 말씀드리고 싶은 것 중에 하나는, 지금 이제 덴마크에서 나온 그 영향평가, 디지털 산업 인권 영향평가에 관한 내용에서 영향평가가 무엇인지를 설명을 하면서 이제 실사와 영향평가는 다르다 이렇게 이제 하고, 그것도 굉장히 특이했고, 그 다음에 이제 영향평가를 소위 우리가 이제 인권의 부정적 영향을 식별하고 파악하는 활동이다 이렇게 이제 이해하는 경우들이 많은데, 여기에서는 이제 그렇게 하질 않고 식별 파악을 하는 것뿐만 아니고 영향평가 자체가 이해관계들 사이의 대화를 촉진하는 과정이다. 그러니까 이제 정보를 끌어내는 과정이 아니고 정보를 주는 과정이고 소통하는 과정이다. 그래서 이제 이해관계자들에게 실제로 인파워먼트를 주는 절차다. 인권 영향평가라고 하는 것이 이제 그런 굉장히 적극적인 이제 비전을 보여줬다고 하는 부분에서 우리가 관심을 가져야 되는 것이 아닌가 이제 그런 생각이 듭니다. 시간이 얼추 다 됐기 때문에 이제 마지막으로 발표자분들께 마이크를 한번 잠시라도 넘기겠습니다. 특히 이제 김 교수님께서는 이해관계자의 강조를 굉장히 많이 하셨는데, 그 부분을 포함해서 코멘트를 마지막으로 조금 해주시죠.
네, 그 질문들이 여러 가지 많이 들어왔는데요. 두 가지 부분에 관련된 답을 좀 드리겠습니다. 먼저 사브리나 로우 연구원님께서 여러 가지 신기술에 관련된 인권 영향 평가 영역을 컴바인해 나간다면 어떤 방법이 있고 국제 규범과 가이드라인이 이런 경우에도 여전히 적용될 수 있을 것인가. 앞서서 커넬 자문관께서도 말씀을 해주신 것처럼 AI와 디지털 기반의 디지털 액티비티가 한 산업군이 아니라 전체 산업에 대해서 광범위하게 나타나고 있기 때문에 공통된 부분은 함께 접목해서 사용을 하되 산업별로 좀 더 구체적으로 접근해야 될 것들은 아주 스파시픽한 인디케이터들을 산업적 특성에 만들어 나가야 하는 그런 상황에 있다고 생각을 합니다. 따라서 여전히 그 비즈니스와 휴먼 라이츠의 가장 기본이 되는 UNGP 등 국제적 규범들은 기본적 원칙을 제시하는 준거로서 상당히 중요하다라는 생각이 들고요. 단지 이런 것들을 얼마나 유연하게 잘 접목시켜 나가면서 기술적 특성에 맞게 세부화해 나갈 수 있을 것인가가 중요하다고 생각을 합니다. 따라서 그런 것들을 해 나갈 수 있는 기반은 우리가 이해관계자들과의 허심탄회한 그런 대화들이 기반이 되어야 된다는 생각이 들고요. 플로어에서 들어온 질문들이 여러 가지 있는데 한 가지만 좀 답변을 드리겠습니다. 사실 적절한 인권 영향 평가가 현실적으로 제대로 이루어지지 않는데 어떤 조건이 필요하고 또 국제 규범이 많이 있지만 이게 진짜 제대로 실행되지 않는 게 현실이라면 우리가 어떻게 해야 될 것인가? 제가 생각할 때는 어떤 의미에서는 휴먼 라이츠 듀 딜리전스가 왜 의무화되어 가고 있는지를 우리가 한번 생각해 볼 필요가 있다는 그런 느낌이 들었습니다. 제일 먼저 중요한 것은 기업 구성원들의 인식 전환이고 앞서서 로나 맥그리거 교수님께서도 말씀해 주신 것처럼 실행하고자 하는 경영진들의 리더십, 의지가 굉장히 중요하다고 생각이 됩니다. 그리고 이 기업과 인권이라는 것이 불필요한 어떤 또 하나의 규제가 아니라 기업의 지속 가능성을 위해서 꼭 필요한 가장 근본적인 경영의 원칙이라는 인식 전환이 있다면 향후에 신기술 분야와 같이 새로운 도전들이 오더라도 이런 것들을 제도적인 부분에 부족함이 다소 일체적으로 나타날 수는 있겠지만 궁극적으로는 잘 해소해 나갈 수 있을 것이라는 생각이 듭니다. 감사합니다.
예, 시간이 얼추 많이 지났습니다. 지금 이제 전국에서 신기술과 이제 영향평가 관련해서 한국에서도 이렇게 하고 있고 사실 글로벌에서도 영향평가가 여러 번 있었습니다. 근데 이제 진짜로 모범 사례를 이제 만들어 나가고 하는 것이 중요한 것 같습니다. 그리고 한국에서도 그런 모임이 있다고 하는 것을 말씀을 드리고 마지막으로 로바 맥그리거 선생님께 이제 토론을 마지막 정리를 좀 부탁을 드리고 동시에 한국에서 모범 사례를 만드는 데 필요한 자문이라고 할까요? 권고라고 할까요? 제안이라고 할까요? 좀 그런 마지막 덕담도 한번 말씀을 부탁을 드리겠습니다.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a really incredible panel and discussion. I think what everyone has highlighted is that we have a lot of challenges ahead in implementing a holistic framework to identify and address human rights harm in the tech sector. But I think everyone has highlighted that there is a clear framework and there's a lot of knowledge on how to do this. I think for a next step, what would be incredibly helpful would be for companies and states to provide more information and transparency around the organizational and practical and policy challenges that they are facing in identifying and addressing human rights harm, so that we can really look at how to operationalize the human rights standards and norms that we already have. So I would say that emphasizing the point that has been made the whole way through, stakeholder engagement is critical, and part of that engagement is also the actors that are implementing and carrying out impact assessments and other strategies. And it would be really important to hear more about what the experience is in doing so.
마지막으로 이해관계자의 중요성 그리고 투명성에 대해서 말씀해 주셨습니다. 여기 오신 모든 분들이 사실은 다 이해관계자들이고 다 같이 이야기해야 될 사람들이고 모두가 정보를 공유해야 될 사람인 것 같습니다. 그걸 기초로 해서 한국 사회가 좋은 모범 사례를 만들고 국제사회에도 좋은 영향을 미칠 수 있기를 기대합니다. 오늘 먼 데서 토론과 발표를 해주신 모든 선생님께 감사드리고 늦게까지 자리를 지켜주신 청중께도 깊이 감사드립니다. 고맙습니다. 이상으로 마치겠습니다.
Okay, so thank you very much to both of our presenters, to all of our panelists, and Professor Lee for moderating this session. So with the conclusion of this session, this brings us to the end of the 13th Asia Human Rights Forum. So thank you very much to everybody who participated today and who helped to make this event successful. We wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you.